because we want to hear from Parmjit Singh, and we're very, very pleased to have him. So my name is Charles Gluckstein, and we have Brenda Agnew, Diane Henderson, and Shelley Dinga that's also helping me organize today. And, you know, a lot of you are familiar with our Compassion Fatigue seminar that we've been running for over a decade. I think this is the 13th annual event. Unfortunately, we couldn't run it this year, as you know, because of COVID, but Parmjit Singh has gladfully taken up the invitation to help us run a virtual version by webinar, and we'd love to know your reaction on how this goes today. Our world is reacting to a terrible pandemic, as you know. Mental health is critical, and especially during this time of crisis social distancing, which can make us feel very anxious and isolated. Our caregivers and frontline workers are especially in need of support and resources. And all of us have suffered, but they have suffered the most. So I want to introduce Dr. Parmjit Singh, who has been a repeated favorite for us for Compassion Fatigue. He is an assistant clinical professor in family medicine at McMaster, has a PhD in psychology, clinical training in mind-body medicine from Harvard in Boston. He's participated in intensive retreats on mindfulness and stress reduction. So he's got a very long resume. I really, really encourage you to look him up on Dr. Parmjitsingh.com. He's a certified yoga teacher. He's done TEDx speaking. He's run shops at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. The list goes on and on. So, you know, being exposed to this intense stress and the emotional strain that we're all feeling, I want to pass the mic over to Parmjit to guide us through, which is a very short session. We have only an hour, so that's why I've kept my introductions very short, and help us through this, Parmjit. So I'm going to pass you as the host, and I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you, Charles, very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me once again. Just to echo you, that always have been my favorite place to go, because we get to talk about compassion, something which is very, in fact, natural to human beings, but have been swept aside by logical thinking. So I'm very glad to be here. And I want to keep the session very practical. So there's no presentation, just simple few minutes of talking just to set the framework. And then I would like you to take you through some very practical things which can help us manage extreme stress. So we are all within this pandemic, something unexpected, sudden, improbable event, which has a huge consequences, both in short term and long term. And especially when we think of short term and long term consequences, it always creates a massive amount of stress. And we all know that stress disrupt our biology and our decision making and our health and our ability to care for others. I want to keep these things very technical here, but I just want to give you a few just references so that you have a sense what I'm talking about and what it does to us. And then go from there just into the practical point. I tend to think that these frameworks are useful, but more useful is the practical aspect, which can allow us to mitigate some of the stress. So let's quickly talk about the stresses. The stress usually comes in form of two things. One is acute stress. For example, you are having an event which passes over in a short period of time, and that will generate acute stress. Acute stress oftenly is useful because it optimizes our immune system and cognition and all sort of things. So that's why we go running, and doing short spurts of stress are good for us. And then there's other kind of stress, which is very chronic, which means that it's drawn out monotonic stress, which continues somehow over the period of time, which we all know that has a major long-term consequences on health. And then on the top of it, add pandemic into it. Pandemic is something like acute stress over the extended period of time, which in fact raise all the risk factors of disrupting our basic biological functions, impairing our health, impairing our decision-making capabilities, and also messing up our ability to take care of ourselves, what we call self-care, and also caring for others, because caring for others is stressful in itself, and add the pandemic stress to it, it becomes an entirely different ball game. So as Charles was talking about, all the healthcare providers and all the frontline workers have been the heroes of this time, because they have been bearing the brunt under very stressful conditions and highly under-equipped to deal with this virus condition. So that's pretty much what happens when we are exposed to extreme circumstances and what it does to us in the short term and the long term. And I suspect that even though we are into the middle of it, its impact are going to continue to reverberate over the period of time, months and years, because once we get a sigh of relief, the actual stress response is going to become even more pronounced. So now you must be thinking about what can we do? And we all have some strategies up our sleeves. I want to briefly touch upon a couple of things and then go into the stuff I'm very familiar with. I would though say that the thing I'm going to share with you, that's one of the things that would work in any circumstances. That's not the only thing. So please keep that in mind. You may already have some things which might be able help you go through this stress response and stressful circumstances. But what I'm going to do is what I am familiar with, what I practice every day, and what I have benefited from hugely over the period of years. So a few things you can do just to mitigate the stress response on every day. That's a pretty commonsensical stuff, the basic stuff of eating well, sleeping well, exercising, engaging any relaxation exercises. All those sort of things we are pretty much familiar with. Relationships are very important in this respect, but there's actually a kind of a flag here, it's a rider here, because lockdown poses a very specific set of challenges. For example, it challenges our relationships. So relationship usually would be very protective day-to-day life, but if our relationship with other people of the family, we are locked in, that can have a deleterious impact on the way we manage our stress and the way we manage our self-care and provide care to others. And then the fear, the most important thing which I wanted to talk to you, that the primal fear of death and dying, which is related to pandemic, adds another interesting twist to this whole process, that people are freaked out. And part of it is that it has kicked up a primal fear of death and dying, and that can literally shift the way we perceive situations and work through the challenges that arise from moment to moment. And then there's a fact of infectiousness and contagiousness. And if you notice, all these factors keep on adding layers into the challenge we are experiencing. So lockdown has presented us a very peculiar challenge where most of the stuff we could be able to do is also not able to do because we are locked in. And as much as we think that this is a time where we can do a lot of things, people are still struggling a lot to manage things even when there's a lot of free time, because there's a lot of expectations and people are feeling like they are not really rising up to the challenge. And to me, that adds another twist to the stress. There's expectation that we should be able to do certain things like working out at home, eating well at home, sleeping well at home, because you have all the time now and you can have a flexibility. But I think there's the other side to the story, that this expectation has caused more stress to a lot of people because they are not following the social drama of optimizing and maximizing all this response. And that's true for in any industry you work in. I get to talk to students and they are going through that. I get to talk to teachers, they are going through that. I get to talk to healthcare providers, and they're going through that. There's expectation that one should be able to optimize and maximize these times for personal development and picking up new hobbies and doing all those sort of things. That sounds very nice theoretically, but it also adds one more expectation or one more thing we have to do in order to manage our stress or manage our affairs day-to-day life. So those are the few things. These are the basic stuff we can do, and the challenges which is posed by the pandemic, COVID-19, unexpected happening. So now I want to shift gear to something very practical, and I want to say it once again so that we are on the same page. This is one of the technique I'm familiar with. This is not the only technique that would work in any stressful circumstances. But there's one thing I would like to add here and suggest to you to explore is that what we know from science, and it is indicated that if we are working with the normal stressors of life, for example, your day 9 to 5 kind of job, and you have so many emerging things you have to take care, and there's a stress associated with that. And you can, it seems like that if you engage in a typical cognitive restructuring or cognitive behavior therapy kind of intervention, they work very well under that circumstances. However, whenever we start talking about something very existential, which is related to the primal fear of death and dying and harm to us and to the one who we love, it seems like these techniques are not very effective. So just I want to clear that you might be benefiting from day-to-day life from doing certain things which are very cognitive, which are very intellectual, which allows you to shift the thought process in a more positive way. But somehow strangely, it is indicated that the existential stuff is not mitigated by that kind of intervention. And for that, we have to do something more deeper, which allows us to shift the way we perceive these fears and existential threats in a much more deeper level. And this is where I want to speak to you about two things. One is the idea of mindfulness, which I'm very familiar with it. This is part of my personal practice. That's I'm going to share with you. But please keep in mind, this is one of the practices, not the only practice. But I would invite you to consider this in the spirit of inquiry, curiosity, and playfulness. And if you approach it, you will see that these techniques can be very helpful in managing extreme stress, especially the one generated by the existential stuff like fear and the primal fear of death and dying and the harm to others and to one during unpredicted sudden events like pandemic. So first, I will talk briefly about mindfulness, and then I will add one small thing, which is actually fits within the context of the compassion, the event that is annually hosted by Gluckstein. And compassion fatigue always have been talked about. I will talk about self-compassion. I will not talk about fatigue because the context of this session with you is about managing extreme stress during these circumstances or crisis of improbable consequences. And self-compassion is one of the wonderful technique to, in fact, almost a counterintuitive technique to manage stress and mitigate stress. And it's not very much encouraged in our society. We often think of kindness as a personal weakness. But if you are to actually look at the brain of someone who is being kind, you will notice that kindness is one of the very important strategic advantages you have when you're making really good decisions, because brain starts to function very differently. So I will come to that part later on once we have actually talked about the mindfulness. So these two things I'm going to briefly talk to you, but I'm going to keep the mindfulness part more practical. So that gives you a skill set to manage it. And then if you can add compassion and self-compassion to that, it becomes a wonderful combination to help you manage extreme stress, especially stresses that are generated by extreme events and which kicks up a fear related to death and dying. So you might have heard about mindfulness. It's pretty much common these days. So very succinctly, mindfulness is about paying attention to whatever is in front of you. So that would mean that if you are experiencing something unpleasant, see if you can pay attention to that. If you're paying attention, if you are experiencing something pleasant, see if you can pay attention to. That's actually the technical definition of mindfulness. And there's a very specific process how we do that. So there's usually a 3-step process through which we learn to be present. One is that pay attention to whatever is happening to you in this moment. Second, acknowledge the experience that comes from that paying attention. And the third one is that see if you can not react to that experience, at least immediately. So the whole enterprise of the mindfulness, especially the aspect of how you train your mind, is pretty much focused on those 3 things. Pay attention to what is happening in front of you, acknowledge the experience that comes from that, and then see if you can learn to not react to things, at least immediately. And if you were to react because the situation calls for an immediate reaction, a reaction that comes from a state of pause and reflection, even after a moment, will have a different quality and consequences than if it comes automatically. So that is literally a training aspect of the mindfulness. Attention, pay attention, acknowledge, don't react, repeat. That's essentially how it is trained. And you will notice that we are very familiar with this. This shell to pass is a perfect example of how to actually be mindful and not react to things that are thrown at us every moment due to whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. So, but the more important aspect here is that how do we change the very basic function of our mind, that reactions, we are able to catch ourselves before we react. And this is where the practice comes in. This is what I described to you is a very intellectual definition of mindfulness. And you will notice many people taking a position that you don't have to engage in a formal practice because you can learn to do these things just on your own. I want to remind you that it would work very well as long as your life is going okay and there's no major stressors. If you are able to pause, it means you have already, there's not much stressors in your brain. If you're not able to pause, that's where we need to bring this practice in. So formal practice of training your brain to be slightly less reactive is what is the really important part of the mindfulness practices, which oftenly is not being advocated these days because it has become slowly becoming watered down and becoming a lot more intellectual, which does not serve greater purpose. So let's take a few minutes to work through this. So in order for you to, or for me or anybody, if you want to learn a mindfulness skill, we need to find something on which we can pay attention. And because this is not based on any belief system, we always pick something within us. So that could be your breath, that could be your body, that could be anything you do. But for the purpose of this session, let's pick our breath. It's common to all of us, and it's secular, it's private, and we have some sort of experience of breath. Whether you have paid attention to it intentionally or not, we all tend to breathe, and it's a mundane enough. That's a very important aspect. You don't want to pick anything which is interesting, because that will require that the brain will automatically like it, and it will not be a great training faculty. You don't want to also pick something which you don't like it. That's the opposite of not liking, and the brain will automatically react to it. We want something which is neutral enough, and breath for most part is very neutral. Unless somebody has breathing issues, we usually don't care for breath. It continues in and out ever since we are born, and will do so until the last day of our life. So it's neutral enough, personal enough, secular enough for it to act as an object on which we can actually train our attention. So for the purpose of the practical learning about how to be mindful, see if you can pay attention to your breath. And for sit whichever way you want to sit, lie down whichever way you are, those are not very important details. If you are sitting, sit in a way you can breathe properly. And if you're lying, lie in a way that you can breathe properly. If your lungs are comfortable enough and your breathing is not constrained, you are doing what needs to be done. And just pay attention to your breath for a few moments. Remember, there's no other expectation. The first step is that pay attention. You're not trying to do anything. You're not trying to de-stress. You're not trying to do anything. You're simply learning to pay attention. So breath comes in, goes out, comes in, goes out, comes in, goes out. And just pay attention. Just approach it from the state of curiosity, inquiry, and playfulness. Don't worry about if the breath comes long or short. Just approach it from the state of curiosity, that I want to know how it feels like breathing. How does the breath feels when it goes into my nostrils, into my lungs, when it turns out and comes out? Do you feel any difference? Do you feel that breath feels warm or cold? Just inquire into the process. And because it's not very interesting and it's very mundane, it will require some effort from your side to actually do this. And this is the very important aspect. It's asking you to pay attention to something. It's asking you to pay attention to something which is not very emotionally charged, but mundane enough. Just pay attention as the breath comes in, goes out. Just go in with the breath, come out with the breath. Don't try to change anything. Now, after a few moments, so this is the first step. Now you're paying attention. And because attention is being paid within you, this act is going to start kicking up some experience. Stories will come to your mind. You will start to feel uncomfortable. Things you have done in the past, things you have to do in the future, all those narratives and stories will come up. And whatever comes up and whatever shows up in your awareness, acknowledge it. So that's the second step. Don't try to brush it away. Don't try to rationalize. Don't try to find a story, why it is happening, why it should not be happening. Don't worry about that part. Just acknowledge it's already there. So whether you like it or not, it makes no difference. Acknowledge it. It is there. And then the third step is that see if you don't react to this story or the experience that is coming from the standpoint of observing your breath in the same way you have always done in the past. So if you reacted to that unpleasant experience in a particular way, today for the purpose of experiment, purpose of a curiosity or playfulness, just simply try not to do the same thing, if it is possible. Or if you have to react to it, maybe react after a moment. Create a pause. So pay attention, acknowledge, and the third step is that don't react, at least immediately. So please remember, there's no expectation that you should be relaxed. You should not be struggling to relax. Your task is just simply to pay attention. I have not given any other instructions. Please try not to add anything to it. And even if you're familiar with this stuff, for the purpose of uniformity, just keep it as minimalist as possible. And now we are going to make it slightly more structured. So this is a more like exploratory way of knowing what it means to be present. And a couple of things here. The fact that you're paying attention to your breath makes you present, because breath always happens in the present. So there's nothing mystical, nothing metaphysical happening here. You've simply picked something which always happens in the present moment. And as long as you pay attention to it from a non-judgmental standpoint, you remain present. And if you don't react to anything that happens in that moment, you have suddenly found a different way to do things. Just for a moment, notice if you don't react to the same thing in the same way as you have done in the past, you will notice that you have now started to change a pattern which might be unhelpful or unwholesome. Now, if you do this multiple times, day after day, what is going to happen is that your habit patterns will become very prominent in your mind. You will start to recognize them. You will start to pay attention to all those things. And some of those habit patterns will be wholesome and you will continue to nurture them. But during this whole process of observation, you will also notice a lot of patterns which are unwholesome, which are disruptive, which are unhealthy. And what happens that over the period of time, you will start to shift these unwholesome patterns to more healthier patterns. So if you want to describe mindfulness in a different way, it is also identifying and recognizing our habit patterns. And then on the basis of that recognition, we change the unwholesome one to the wholesome, and we continue to nurture the wholesome to be better. That essentially is another way to look at it. So we'll continue our practice, and we are going to add one more thing to make it more structured. So far, you have been just paying attention to your breath, and it's very unstructured way of paying attention. And you might notice that your mind wanders away, and you can bring it back. It's caught up in the stories and all sort of things you might be experiencing at that moment. But what about if you add one thing into it, something to stabilize your mind? And the way we stabilize our mind is just give it an anchor. So we are going to start counting from 9 to 1. This is not an essential part of the practice, but it is a good way to learn the practice at initial stages. Once you become familiar with this, that your mind is stable enough to be just pay attention to the breath, just like that, you will drop the counting. So when you breathe in next time, we are going to start counting from 9 to 1 like this. Breathe in, 9. Breathe out, 9. Breathe in, 8. Breathe out, 8. Breathe in, 7. Breathe out, 7. And so on until you reach 1 without interruption. Each time you feel interrupted or your mind has been hijacked by whatsoever, it doesn't matter. Notice that you have been hijacked. That's the acknowledgement part. And without being irritated, that's the don't react part. Bring your mind back to the breath and start from the beginning. It does not matter if your mind lost the count at 8 or even within 9 or 7. Just dutifully go back and start again. So this is very important aspect of the practice and how to build mindfulness skills. One is discipline, which means that each time you find your mind wandering, you dutifully bring it back and start again. That's part of the disciplined aspect of learning a skill. The second part is gentleness. And gentleness is that don't be irritated, don't be frustrated, don't consider it as a personal failure if your mind cannot stay focused on a breath. Be kind to yourself, be gentle to yourself, but bring your attention back and start again. So these almost contradictory things are happening. You are disciplined, but you are also gentle. You're disciplined in being participating in the process of learning the skill, but you're letting go that that skill has to happen today in this moment. So those two interesting things are happening, which are very important um, stepping stone for developing self-compassion. Because if we cannot be kind to ourselves when our mind wanders away from a breath, it will be incredibly difficult to be kind when we mess up big times. So these small things, these small gestures allows us to build this idea of self-compassion, not laziness. Self-compassion is a very active process of doing what needs to be done, but letting go that certain things have to be done in certain ways. So 9, 7, 8, 7, 6, and if you reach 1, go back and start the process once again. Attend, acknowledge, don't react, repeat. And all this is happening in a larger framework, what we call everything is temporary. Things come and go. Your thoughts are temporary, our bodies are temporary, our fears, even though they seem like endless, they are still subject to that temporariness. And if you notice, you will actually observe how things come and go. A thought comes, stay there for a moment, and then just simply disappears. And another thought comes in. It has a different quality, different emotional value. So all this process continues in this larger framework that things are always temporary. They're always changing. So breathing in, you notice, you breathe. Breathing out, you notice you're breathing out. And count. If your mind wanders away, notice, bring it back, start again. Try not to add many things. Try not to add any mantras or recitations, nothing. Keep it as simple and minimalist as possible. Minimalist things while working with your mind are very effective. They can be daunting at the beginning because there are not many crutches. For example, if you play music in the background, if you have visualizations, they might actually provide you good distractions. They might spare you some of the unpleasantness that comes from facing yourself and your mind. But in the long term, they don't help us in the great scheme of things. If you keep things very minimalist, it might be difficult in the beginning, but it will help you build up a skill set which will be very powerful because you don't have to let go of anything afterwards. The habit formation starts from a foundation which is very solid. So please keep that in mind, that we are learning a skill, a new skill of working with the mind, a different way of doing things within familiar circumstances, a different way of not reacting to things, a learning to be intentional and deliberate. And whenever we are in that mode of learning, you will notice that it always is unpleasant. And this is another important point I would like to leave you with, is that in our society, we have made these skills as simply skills to experience pleasant feeling of stress release and all those things. And these things does all these things very well. We have historical evidence, we have a scientific evidence, yet at the same time, it in fact shortchange people that it the change has to be pleasant. Change is never pleasant. If you're learning a new skill, it is always unpleasant. So if you feel uncomfortable, it is part of learning a new skill. It's nothing really bad stuff or any unsavory stuff happening here. Meditation is not doing that to you. You will happen to experience unpleasantness anytime you learn a new skill which you're not familiar with. But one way to think about this is that if you're willing to live with 10 minutes of discomfort of knowing yourself, facing your thought process, facing your chaotic mind and runaway emotions and all sort of things that stress us, you might feel that your life outside of those 10 minutes becomes a lot more comfortable. So that's one of the best return to investment ratio you will ever find. If you can be willing to be uncomfortable for 10 minutes, especially at initial stages, you will notice things become better as we go through these things. Skill, once it becomes more expert, it is not unpleasant as much as in the beginning. So we're going to take 3 more breaths like this. Breathing in, breath comes in, breathing out, breath goes out. Your task is to simply pay attention, count. If your mind goes away, bring it back, start again. And once you are able to do these 3 things, you can pause, and then you can come back. So this is essentially, if you ever start a mindfulness practice, or if you want to continue doing it and you had a previous exposure, this is essentially will do. There's nothing really mystical about it. It's a very simple technique to help become aware of your wandering mind and chaotic mind, and gives you a systematic tools to work through it. It's a difficult process, challenging process, but worth doing it. It's another thing I want to add before we get into the questions and answers is that this is how you lay the foundation for your mindfulness skills. And you will notice that your mind is calm and collected and tranquil. It is a lot more efficient. It has a huge positive impact on your health, sleep cycles, decision making, because one of the disruption you will feel is when you're stressed out, we make really bad decisions. It improves our relationships. When you are comfortable in your own skin, you will notice that that comfort comes across to other people. They feel comfortable around you, and that forms rapport and enhance our communication. It enhances our leadership presence, because you become a role model for others to follow, because you can keep things in a way which are healthier, but in a way that you are also acknowledged. It's not a kind of a where you park things somewhere. It's just you acknowledge that being human is like that. And I want to leave you with, before we jump to the questions and answer session, is the idea of self-compassion. You will find it interesting that if you find a dictionary, compassion in our word doesn't mean love and affection for yourself. So that's why we have to add self into it. In Eastern tradition, compassion means the both. When you're being compassionate, it means you're being loving and affectionate and accepting to yourself as much as to others. One thing I would suggest that each time you engage in mindfulness practice, if you do it for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, less or more, that's up to you. Just before you finish your practice, just for a minute or so, just to remind yourself to be compassionate. Just remembering that you're human, that we have Achilles heels, that we make mistakes, that we are messy, that we are unkempt, can allow you to be compassionate. Just remembering that we are human and that not every day we can be superhuman, that we make mistakes, allows us to actually develop that self-compassion and the idea of being human. And it allows us to become better within our skins. It allows other people to become better around us, because compassionate people will actually make other people feel more accepting in their own presence, because they are able to accept themselves. That likely extends to other people. So it's there's not much, even though self-compassion is a training in itself, but just remembering to be human and remembering your messiness and your unkemptness and your Achilles heel can help you cultivate that self-compassion, because compassion is one of the things Gluckstein has been always advocating. And it's very necessary in the context when you are surrounded by fear and difficult emotions, and especially the fear, which is primal fear. So compassion can be a wonderful way to mitigate some of the negative consequences of being in a highly stressed out circumstances. So that's pretty much the practical part. I want to just repeat once again so that we are on the same page. Mindfulness is an act of paying attention to whatever is in front of you. It does not discriminate between pleasant and unpleasant. There's a specific way to train for mindfulness, and that training is usually a 3-step process. You pay attention, you acknowledge the experience that come from paying attention, and third, you learn over the period of time not to react to the emerging experiences in this way or that way, and develop that kind of a non-judgmental observation. And if you have to react, then that reaction happens out of clarity. And all this happens in the larger scheme of what we call everything is temporary, or things are temporary. And the way we train for it, pick an object within us, and because it's not based on a belief system, we are the common denominator in this practice. You pick something, whatever is relevant to you, and you start paying attention to it. And anything that comes out of that paying attention, you acknowledge the experience, and then you work with the experience. And that over the period of time will change your habit patterns. Very soon, in fact, functionally, you will feel your habit patterns will change almost within a few weeks. And if you do it long enough, you will notice that the brain starts to shift to positive side within 8-9 weeks. And then on the top of it, just because you have been working with the mind, just give yourself a little bit of compassion, love, and affection in the terms of remembering yourself, reminding yourself that you are human, you make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistake, and then learn from it. Also remembering, I would add here, that self-compassion is not a call for laziness or carelessness or engaging in any kind of behavior which in fact can be passed on. So it's a very active process where you do whatever needs to be done, but you do not over blame yourself. That's actually the key here. So it is nowhere called to be lazy or undisciplined or careless. On that note, I will pause here and I will take questions. Give me a moment. I'm working from my phone because computer was not very cooperative with me.
Dr. Singh, it's Brenda. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I've also got some of the questions here. So if it's easier, I can just ask them to you and moderate that if you want to, if I ask them and you want to answer them.
Yes, I can do that. Yeah.
Is that okay? So one of the questions we had that came in was, what would be the difference between empathy and compassion?
It's actually, it's a moving school of thought. It can be a session in itself and a lot more. Empathy, usually, if you look at it from a theoretical perspective, sometimes some people say that empathy is a beginning space for compassion. you look at from the scientific perspective, like neuroscience, it seems like that when you're being compassionate, it tends to activate different different circuits. For example, when people are being empathetic, they are more mirroring what is being experienced by the person on the other side, which means that creates a lot of rapport and personal interest, personal communication. However, at the same time, they exhibit the most of the emotional quality of that person. So the person, if that person is experiencing unpleasant experience, then the empathetic person will also experience that. On the other hand, if you actually take the same example for a compassionate person, it seems like that compassionate people do not pick the negative experience for other people. They are more attuned to helping the person, and they're more motivated, and they exhibit a lot more positive emotions, even when the person who needs help exhibit a lot more negative emotions. That's actually the brief way of explaining it. Empathy, it seems like, it looks like, has its dark side. It does not have a huge downside when we are talking about positive experiences. For example, if you're empathetic to somebody who is having a positive experience, it will not have a downside because both experiences are positive, and the experience you're going to take home is also the positive. It becomes tricky when the other experience is actually negative, and you get to become the holder of that experience. And if you meet 10 people who are having 10 negative experience, you will most likely take some of those 10 experience home and internalize it. And then it becomes a risk factor for the burnout and stress and all sort of health issues that come from it. In compassion, what we know from science, nothing sort of this happens. Compassion, in fact, has a different quality. It's a quality of motivation and quality of love, very unconditional love. What they have seen, that people who are being very compassionate, the brain tend to activate circuits which are related to unconditional life, like maternal love. And that's why compassionate people would have they don't usually burn out, because I think the way they look at the human experience is very differently. So a lot of people have different opinions. I would say that about this empathy and compassion, but my personal sense, and I would say this is my opinion here, is that I think we should focus on building compassion, because compassion is a lot more protective, especially under difficult circumstances, especially if you are in a pandemic and you see all those suffering. It is going to be actually a lot more helpful to be compassionate than empathetic. Though empathetic people will come across a lot more as if they resonate with other people. Compassionate people might come across as dispassionate, which means they're detached. But within from that detachment comes their ability to see things very clearly, react appropriately, do what needs to be done, and help the person overcome the situation they are in.
Wonderful.
I think that's,
yeah. That's a complicated one to answer, but thank you for that. We've got a couple more questions here. We have one that says, I'm just wondering if Dr. Singh can provide any other examples of what one might attend to when practicing mindfulness. Any examples other than breath?
Anything you can do means anything you can engage in can become part of the practice. Like you eating can be part of the practice. You walking can be practice. You hug. These days that's off limit, but still that's on the table. Hopefully one day that will be. So anything you are able to intentionally engage in can become part of the practice. The only thing I will say, and once you start actually doing this, you will notice that anything you do in life is actually practice. Your life is a practice. So I will say that the reason by we use breath is because you will notice that breath is the basic thing that makes us human. And it's not very distracting. There's not much you can distract with. Breath, you are literally on your own, and your life will come face to face. You will come face to face with your life. And all the things that will come to you, if you're able to change them, whatever needs to be changed, that's the most effective yet challenging part of practice. Anything you do more which allows you to distract, for example, walking itself can act as a distraction. So I am biased here, but I would say that anything you can engage in, and in fact, your life is a practice. That's what meditators often say, that beyond breathing and beyond eating and beyond walking, anything you engage in, if you can be intentionally present in that engagement, you are practicing mindfulness. I hope this is helpful.
Thank you. Another question that has come in here is, it says, thank you for reminding us of our messiness and to be non-judgmental of ourselves. Do you have a link or a video that you like to use for mindful breathing?
I actually recently, because of this COVID thing, I started a podcasting series. It's called Passing Clouds. It's actually built on the idea that things are always temporary. And it is not yet available on Apple and Google, but it's available on my YouTube channel. And I can send it out. If you actually search my name and go to my website, it has a YouTube channel is there. It's just, I activated this last month, and we have 5-6 podcasts there. And a couple of those are actually have these practical skills there, because those were recorded when I was doing things for students. So they're wonderful free resource for you to get to if you want. And I will be adding, for example, podcast every 2 weeks. So the next one is coming on kindness. So I unpack what it means to kind and what you can do, in fact, to do that.
I've added in the show notes the link to those, both your site and to the podcast videos for the attendees.
Oh, thank you so much.
Right. We can also include those too in the email that we send out to the attendees after this is over. I think we have time for, I'm going to try to squeak in one more, but maybe two more, Dr. Singh, before I ask Charles to wrap it up. But we have one question here that says, Dr. Singh, do you have any recommendations for introducing mindfulness to someone who is skeptical of this kind of practice or that it will work for them?
I love skeptics because they are the best meditators. I am a skeptic. I came from a science background, and I bristle at when people try to package it in a variety of ways. So the thing is, I would say that we observe, always we observe. Science is an act of observing things outside. And I invite those skeptics that, can you observe yourself? You don't have to believe everything, but exactly that's the way science works. That's why I always say that you have to approach these things from a state of curiosity, playfulness, and skepticism. I did not use the word skeptical empirical approach because I didn't want to go kind of a jargony here. But actually, that's the best way to test drive anything, and more so about mindfulness, because sometimes it can be packaged in a variety of mystical stuff, which is just people come up with those ideas. So I would say that the person who is interested in, ask them, can you observe yourself just the way you observe outside? And you don't have to believe anything. It's you and your breath, your body, or anything you do. And I think skeptics are most likely to see that if it is about observation, there's nothing really unscientific going on here. It's a wonderful way to come to know of yourself. And in fact, most of the philosophers always talked about knowing yourself. And what best way to know than to turn your attention toward yourself, the same attention we turn to outside world. Does it help?
Yeah, I think, if I'm looking at the questions, the way you've answered, yeah, I think that is absolutely helpful. So thank you for that. And I'm going to try to squeeze one more in here, and I don't know if it'll be too lengthy, but I think it's a good question, and it almost follows up on this one, I guess, a little bit. But it says, I've had a client that experiences anxiety when focusing on their breath, in that they start feeling as if they are not getting enough oxygen. This tends to happen as soon as they focus on the breath, so not an actual medical symptom. The more they pay attention to the breath, the more anxious they get. Any suggestions for them?
Yes, it's actually, thank you. That's a very, very important, I think, safety thing. Within this question is a very important safety issue. So, for example, if someone comes to me in my courses in the community, and if they say that I have anxiety, I would actually needle them a little bit. What kind of anxiety, if it is managed or not. I would say this is pretty much we have to err to the side of safety, because safety of individual who practice has to come first. So if someone asks me this question, I would say that if your anxiety seems to be amplified when you pay attention to the breath, maybe this is not the time to practice this. Maybe you have to find a different way. Maybe for them, the body scan would be a better way to start. Because it is true that sometimes people who have a tendency to be anxious, when they pay attention to the breath, anxiety, in fact, go through the roof, which actually makes them feel that they are running out of oxygen. So that's not very uncommon symptoms. So in order to work through that, maybe asking them do something different. Maybe body scan could be actually a useful way to do that. Maybe walking could be another way to introduce to them. And once they get used to this process, and then asking them or inviting them to actually see if can you now play with the breath a little bit. You know, I always use the word, can you be curious and play with the breath a little bit after you have introduced to them. So, but I will take few steps. And to me, the safety of the person who is doing would be the paramount in any circumstance. So there's another way you can do that. In my experience, sometimes people respond very well to the body scan. And after doing the body scan for a long period of time, then they become open to experimenting with the breath. And it has happened in my courses. So that's pretty much actually easier and safer way to work through that. I don't think they have to suffer through this process because it will be counterproductive.
Thank you. Go ahead, Charles.
Thanks, Brenda. So I just want to be mindful of our time and be very, very thankful to Dr. Singh for his guidance. This has been a tremendous hour. It's amazing to watch you, Dr. Singh, just go through everything, no notes, all just looking at your iPhone and guiding us, and it's just been very soothing and reassuring, and really, really appreciate you stepping up to the plate when we really were out of options. We had to turn this into a webinar. You filled the void, and we're just extremely grateful. We filled the room in terms of what we were allowed in registrations. We were sold out at 100. That's as many as we could allow, and probably it's a nice intimate group anyway. We will send out a survey to everyone just to find out what you thought of it. We may be able to offer webinars in the future in addition to having what we hope will be a great return in 2021 to a compassion fatigue seminar in the future. So thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for all of your great wisdom, and please look for the survey and give us your feedback. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, everyone who is in attendance. Again, I will say that you don't have to believe a word I say here. Practice. You will get to know whether this works, and that's the best way to, in fact, work through these skills. Be well, stay well, and I think that's the best we can do in these circumstances. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Singh.
Thank you.